reporter. That's the bit that I'll mess up. Hello and welcome to the book club. Great to have your company, and great to have the company of Alan Biggs, who's the author of today's book. It is Confessions of a Football Reporter. This is the item that you want to get your hands on. It's a really great read. Delighted to have you with us, Alan. Welcome.
Thank you, Nick.
I loved the book. It was really fun. Was it fun to write?
It was a lot of fun to write. I'm glad that you think it was fun to read, because I've done a few interviews, which has been a new experience for me on the other side of the microphone.
Exactly.
Being interviewed for a change. That has certainly been very interesting, but quite a few of the interviewers have only skated through the book. So are you genuinely telling me you've actually read it?
I actually have. Those
cover?
people are amateurs. I want to make that perfectly clear. No, I have read it. It's really good fun, and it bounces along because you've got so much to pack in. You've got a huge number of incidents with people that everybody will know as well.
Well, I tried to sell it on that, unashamedly. For the purposes of that book, I'm a serial name dropper.
Yeah.
I hope I'm not like that normally in everyday conversation and in real life, but this, you could say it was cynical, but it was certainly an attempt to sell the book, not through my name, which one or two people might have heard of. You know, who's that bloke who does the radio or whatever, or writes in newspapers. But the big names that I'd come across, and I thought, well, if we put these together, there's a lot of stories to tell and maybe a lot of appeal, because I think the public are, apart from their great interest in sport, are becoming more interested in the way the media works and the relationships.
Definitely, 100%. I think that's true. And one of the most interesting things about reading the book is seeing it from a different perspective, because I don't think there hasn't been a lot of books written from a sports reporter's perspective, and we'll get into some of the relationships that you had. But tell me how you started out. Tell me how you first got into the line of work that you ended up spending your career in.
Goodness me, it's a long time ago. I suppose it's like all of us, we're sports enthusiasts. Particularly I was a football enthusiast, and you very quickly realise that you're not going to play for your local club, and you're not going to play at any level, any meaningful level, and the next best thing is to, well, maybe I could write about it. And I grew up in Chesterfield. My family moved when I was 8 years old from the Kent area, actually, Bromley, where I was born.
Okay.
And Chesterfield were the team that I followed, and not only did I watch their games, but as a hobby I started writing reports just for my own interest. And I became quite passionate about doing that, and it kicked on from there. Then I got a job as a journalist, news journalist to start with.
Yeah.
That traditional route tends not to be altogether the case now, that people have to go to a local newspaper. But as I mentioned in the book, I think I was given a column in my first week at the Derbyshire Times in Chesterfield, and it was deaths in the district. You know, there's your column. What a great way to start.
Yeah. Did you have to make them funny and entertaining, or was it just...
Absolutely not. Stifled all flair.
Yeah, I can see that.
You know, but instills the value of accuracy, because if you get something wrong in something so personal as that,
that's true.
You know about it, and I did know about it a few times.
It's interesting that you started off out of an authentic kind of passion for the game and passion for writing about it, because you were doing it, you know, for something that you enjoyed to do, not because you were paid initially. And I think a lot of people that get into maybe sports reporting or sports coverage, it is like that for them, I think.
It's almost as if, and we ought to whisper this, that we would do it for nothing.
Yeah.
For no money.
Pretty sure my producer knows that. I've read my contract.
And a few of my employers, they've also twigged. And that's almost the way we're moving now, sadly, in a way that a lot of people in our game are doing things for nothing.
Right.
Just to stay there, and there's not a lot of money around. But at that outset of your career, well, my first game on radio at Wembley, covering Matlock Town against Scarborough in the final of the FA Trophy. And by the way, what a place to start your broadcasting career. It's been downhill all the way since then.
There's an element of style to that. Why, you know, start at Wembley.
Start at the top and work down.
Yeah.
Now that was in 1975, FA Trophy final. And if I remember correctly, my fee was £11 to do that. And I don't think I got any expenses. And I think I came out of that in negative equity.
Not in life enrichment terms, though.
Not in like, no.
That must have been an
absolutely not.
amazing feeling to be reporting on a game at Wembley when you hardly had done anything.
20 years old.
Amazing.
It was. And I had to slip Peter Swan, who was the player manager of Matlock, a fiver, to get him all the way up the stairs to the press box afterwards, because there were no interview facilities downstairs that we could use. I had to get him up to our line in the press box, and Peter had played at the age of, I think he was 39.
Oh, really?
And I had to drag his weary limbs up a very, very long stairwell. Halfway up, have we got much further to go? And I said, well, I'm afraid so, a couple more flights. And he said, is there a fee for this? And I said, well, and I fished a fiver out and gave him that. And that demolished my match fee. But it was worth it.
I would like to see you do that to one of the Man City players now. Here's your
Oh,
fiver for your interview, Carlos. Yeah.
Yeah, had a few noughts.
Now, you went on to be very successful doing what you do on a national level, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I'm just interested, did you have national ambition, or like, I don't know a better phrase, did you have kind of grand ambitions to do it at the highest level when you started out? Or would you have been happy if you'd have just been doing it locally for all of the time you've done it?
I suppose to start with, I would have been happy, or was happy, doing it locally, moving from the Derbyshire Times, from a newspaper to a radio station, well, via cable TV. There was a small cable TV station in Sheffield in the mid-70s, did a bit of work on that, and then to commercial radio, Radio Hallam, and became sports editor there, and loved that job, thoroughly enjoyed it, did it for 5 years. But you're a one-man band, and it's so frustrating that you're having to break your back every week to maintain quite an extensive output. And in the end, I just looked at this and thought, this is impossible. I could do the job, but there had to be a more viable way of doing it. And it was at that point, took the risk, quit. My wife was appalled.
Delighted? No.
I didn't even discuss it with her. Now, this is shameful. I came home from work one day and said, I've quit. There's nothing like that to focus the mind on what became a freelance career in radio and newspapers, and eventually Radio 5, well, I was going to say Radio 5 Live, it was Radio 2 then, and got into that. Yeah,
it's fantastic. And it's almost like, certainly for the first part of the book, there's almost another character in the book, which is kind of the area where you were working, which is Hallam and Sheffield, and the kind of the feeling of how important the sport was to that area. And Radio Hallam was a huge deal, right?
Well, we had 6 clubs, and we called it the Hallam Big Six, and they were all clustered around the main 2, Sheffield United and Sheffield Wednesday. But they weren't the best of times from a success viewpoint. In fact, the teams were pretty much in the doldrums. Most of the teams were at that time. But yeah, you're right. It was good fun. The major characters came later. Jack Charlton, Ron Atkinson, Dave Bassett. Yeah, you can reel them off.
And younger viewers watching this perhaps may not be aware of this, but you refer to it as a golden age, which was when Atkinson was in charge of Wednesday and Bassett was in charge of United. Just talk to us a bit about that, because there's an extraordinary kind of success of both clubs and also clash of personalities between them.
Yeah, we'd had a few lean years, and they were pretty drab and pretty grey. And then these 2 characters arrived, and for a time they were in opposition across the city. And as you say there, Nick, they couldn't have been more opposite.
Right.
In some ways. But what they had in common was the brashness and the extrovert nature of the personality.
Okay.
But in terms of their football success, you had the Mr. Bojangles, the guy who always had an open checkbook, Ron Atkinson, and Harry Bassett, the shoestring scuffler at United. And collectively, just taking them as a whole, you were never short of a story, and they were easy to project as well. You know, you didn't have to sell these people. And at the time, I was a freelance newspaper journalist working for national papers, as well as what became 5 Live, and the job was a joy. Trevor Francis came along after Ron, and there are some stories from there in that book.
Yeah, there's some great stories, and that brings us on to talk a little bit about the characters that you, especially I like the characters in that area, like Len Ashurst is one that you talk about.
I know the story you want me to.
Go for it.
Is this the one in his office after a game?
Yeah.
Right. He had a small office at Hillsborough, and the local radio reporters used to start off by doing their interviews, and the newspaper reporters would be at the back, which was an intimidating experience in that you were interviewing Len in front of them. And he played to the gallery quite often. And you were in an exposed position, as it turns out, in more ways than one, because I think it was a 1-1 draw, and Len could be quite intimidating. He had a caustic, Liverpudlian sense of humour. And I asked him some safe question about whether it had been a fair result or whatever.
Right.
And he looked at me sternly and said, you know, the only thing I've got to say to you, Alan, is your flies are open. Cue gale of laughter from the back of the office, and unfortunately, I looked, and they weren't. But
he sounds lovely.
Len loved it. There was another occasion. He set me up, and I had an interview to do with him in the gym. I was told he was waiting for me through in the gym, and he put a rickety wooden chair at the other side of the desk there for me to pull out. Deliberately, it was pushed in. Had to pull it, and as I pulled it out, it just collapsed into 100 pieces. It was like just fell apart on the floor, and he fell apart. And he was a practical joker. But things like that, at the time, you can feel a bit of a fool, and you can feel half offended. You shouldn't be.
Yeah.
It's part of the banter of the game and the knockabout nature of it. But in years to come, well, with the book, they just become invaluable life experiences, as do the mistakes that I've made.
Yeah, well, we can talk about those, but I'm interested in the incident that's on the front cover, because that's a good story as well, because you mentioned the Liverpudlian sense of humour. This was at Anfield, right, that the incident on the front of the cover happened?
No, it was actually before an FA Cup semi-final at Hillsborough.
Oh, it was at Hillsborough, that's right.
In 1979.
Yeah, crowd, you're right.
Goes back a bit, and I was doing interviews for Radio Hallam on the pitch. Before I had a roving commission, and it was kind of access all areas, incredibly enough. My interviews, besides going out live on the radio, were also being tannoyed live to the crowd as well. And I'd interview...
Is that intimidating? I think most people would find that quite nerve-wracking.
To start with, it was nerve-wracking, and then it kind of gave you a sense of importance and a confidence. And I'd interview Bill Shankly and Terry Neal, the two managers, Liverpool against Arsenal. I interviewed Keith Hackett, the referee, in his dressing room. And I was getting into my stride. And I was in my stride, literally, when I approached Ray Clements, the Liverpool goalkeeper, in the centre circle, and suggested that we did an interview on the march towards the Liverpool fans at one end of the ground, massed behind the goal, which we did, and we started chatting, tannoyed to the crowd. And I decided that we would, as we approached the penalty area, I would give him the big build-up, you know. Liverpool fans, which I did, Liverpool fans, your goalkeeper, Mr. Ray Clements, greeted by total silence, and what you see on the front cover, a sea of Harvey Smith two-finger.
There you go.
There we are.
A sea of two fingers.
Yeah, two fingers. Now, what amazed me then, and still does now, is it was as if they were somehow telepathic in their communication between each other, the fans. That somebody had this idea, and it had, and the Liverpool humour, I think, is, I hate that picture. There's a great picture of Gordon Banks, but
well, tell us about that after the break. We've got to go to a break. Just so 1 second. There'll be more though. Just stick with us for a couple of minutes. I'm with journalist and author Alan Biggs, talking about his new book, Confessions of a Football Reporter. Keep it with us. Welcome back to the Book Club. I'm chatting with journalist and author Alan Biggs about his new book, Confessions of a Football Reporter. Fantastic read. You want to get yourself hold of a copy. Alan, you told us about some of your really amusing incidences, and we were just talking about when the Liverpudlians decided that it would be fun to show you up, as they do.
Which they did, yeah. Which they did. And what do you say to a radio audience when you're presented with hundreds of two fingers? You know, do you tell them what's going on? You know, which you can't. I must admit, it was a stunning moment for me, and I basically ignored it. Ray grinned at me as if he, wasn't surprised by this. But as I say, years later, incidents like that you can play to your advantage, and it's on the front cover, courtesy of a cartoonist friend of mine, Pete McKee, and
it's fantastic.
Your career becomes richer for things like that.
Before the break, you were talking about the amount of banter in football, and I'm kind of interested because your career has spanned, from when you started 70-ish?
Yeah, mid-70s.
Mid-70s, through to the present day, of course. And I'm interested in how it's changed, and particularly how the relationship between reporters and players has changed.
Dramatically.
Dramatically.
The access was always so open.
Right.
And relationships developed until I guess about the last 10 years between journalists on a particular patch and the players at the teams that they covered. I'll give you an example. In Sheffield Wednesday's most recent pomp in the early 90s, when they were one of the foremost teams in the country, you could turn up at Hillsborough most days at lunchtime and walk into the players' entrance and approach players that you'd personally come to know after training.
Right.
And they would be happy to, in most cases, stop and talk to you. I remember when Ron Atkinson took over as manager, he said to the local press pack, he said, right, if anybody wants me, if you want to pop down at 1 o'clock any day of the week, yeah, I'll see you. Now, that is a thing of the past. And it's sad, really, because respectful relationships develop between particularly those players and the journalists. You were able to ring them at home on their mobiles. I can understand what's happened since, that the game has become subject to media saturation. It was only inevitable that the spin doctors would start to get to work.
Right.
And indeed, quite a lot of people in my profession now work as football club spin doctors, press officers.
Really?
Poacher turn gamekeepers.
Right, yeah.
And it is true to say that there were times when a player would sound off about his manager being left out because of the closeness of the relationships that were developed there. And clubs are now smothering that kind of story. So I can see from their perspective where they're coming from in wanting to stage manage these interviews. But that was a time that will never come back in terms of that access.
Right. It is quite fascinating. A couple of more interesting incidents in the book relate to you almost being caught in the middle of something political, like between a player and a manager. And that's perhaps an aspect of the job that people might not, or might be a little bit surprised by.
Which story are you referring to there?
Well, there's a Chris Kamara story.
There was, yes.
Wasn't there? There was
Danny Wilson story.
Danny Wilson story.
Yeah, it's sometimes the more people you know and the more loyalties you build up, you can get caught in the crossfire between two contacts, if you like, two people that you get on with. And a Chris Kamara incident was quite funny looking back on it, and he and I always laugh about it now. His chairman, Geoffrey Richmond, at the time when Chris was manager of Bradford City, Chris and Geoffrey Richmond were good contacts of mine. They would both be very cooperative. And on this occasion, Geoffrey gave me the story that he and Bradford City were trying to bring John Hendry back to the club from Barnsley. Good story, it made the Daily Mail. It wouldn't do now. That was in the days when non-Premiership stories and papers editionised and you'd get good shows for things like that.
Right.
It appeared, and the night that it appeared, a few hours after it appeared, I was covering a Bradford City match for 5 Live and they got stuffed by Sunderland that night, which may explain Chris Kamara's reaction. I didn't feel I'd genuinely done anything that compromised his position at all. I thought that Chris was very much behind this attempt to sign John Hendry. But afterwards, on the stairs, he basically told me if I wanted anything more from his football club, that I should get it from that busybody chairman or whatever.
Right.
And he was very, very annoyed about it. And the scene shifted to a darkened stand. Chris had gone into the stand. I chased after him, said, "Chris, what's the problem?" And the pair of us had this frank exchange there.
Frank exchange of views.
Where I was saying, look, what's your problem, mate? You know, and he was saying, where did you get that story from? Now, subsequently, I can say where I got it, but at the time I was loyal to Geoffrey Richmond, and I said, I can't tell you, but it was from an impeccable source, and I had to run it. And out of the gloom, Geoffrey Richmond, who'd been told, I believe, by his wife about this row going on, appeared, the looming figure, came out of the darkness and said, Alan, is there a problem? And I said, no, Geoffrey. I was getting more embarrassed by the minute. Geoffrey, no, there's no problem. Chris, more sternly, is there a problem? And Chris muttered something and said, no, no. And then Geoffrey rounded on his manager and said, you will apologise to this gentleman of the press. And I didn't know where to put myself and tried to diffuse it's not necessary. Later, after that conversation, I heard that Geoffrey Richmond had threatened to sack Kamara unless he apologised, which he did do by ringing me the next day. But I didn't know that part of it.
Right.
When he rang me, I accepted immediately. These things happen. But it was, at the time, a very sticky situation.
Yeah,
misunderstanding, really.
Yeah, yeah, amazing how that could happen.
Yeah.
The other thing that really interested me was some of the stuff that you talk about in the book about referees. And you've written a number of stories that people will know nationally about referees. You've got a very different take on it, I think, compared to perhaps if you ask the average football enthusiast what he thinks about referees.
Well, I think that it was the value of having a relationship with a particular person in my case. Keith Hackett, a long-time friend of mine, was refereeing when I first started as a journalist, got to know him very well, from Sheffield. I was based in Sheffield. And Keith kind of took me into his world a little bit in a very constructive way, educated me about the difficulties referees face, and I saw the other side of the coin. And he reached the top in his career, subsequently reached the top off the field as well as referee's manager. And that relationship continued. Subsequently, I realised that if I was going to retain an involvement in working for national papers, with my local teams in almost terminal decline at one stage, I was going to have to get into this refereeing area, which was becoming big. And I'd like to think that besides having access at the times when referees had made a mistake and became newsworthy and finding out what was going on, I'd like to think that through Keith I was able to do a lot of good for them as well, a positive story.
Tell us the Alan Wiley story with Sir Alex Ferguson, because that was a big national story and you had a kind of important role in it.
I had an exclusive in the Daily Mail. I knew that after Alex Ferguson had said quite unjustifiably that Alan Wiley wasn't fit. It was outrageous comment.
He's talking about physical fitness, not just that he was bad at the job, right? He was
physical fit. You couldn't come out with a worse slur of a referee than that because of the strict fitness guidelines they have to adhere to. And I knew that this couldn't be right. And I also knew that there were some pro-zone stats that broke down a referee's performance, how far he ran.
Most people wouldn't know that they actually measure the refs. It's
they
amazing.
do. They measure them meticulously.
Yeah.
And I was about to make a few phone calls to try to get hold of those when, lo and behold, let's just say a very good contact in the game. Because these pro-zone stats are circulated among a few people in the game, let me tell you that. Somebody rang me and gave me those stats, which showed that Alan Wiley had in fact run further than most Manchester United players in that game, among many other stats. And it was manna from heaven for me. But apart from the earning capabilities and the good show that I had in the Daily Mail and subsequently in the News of the World following on from that story, I was pleased that actually to do something to redress the balance for Wiley, and people could see quite clearly that this was an outrageous attack. And the FA, who I suspected were going to soft pedal on it, had to act.
And you feel quite strongly that refs are misrepresented a little bit. And one of my favourite passages in the book actually is towards the end where you talk about how Webb agonising over a decision that he got wrong, I think in an Arsenal-Liverpool game. And I think you do a really good job of kind of putting over that different perspective to referees, that they actually do have this enormous professional pride, if you like.
They do, and I think more could be done to portray that.
Right.
You know, they're not allowed license to talk. There's very, very little done, or too little done in my view, to proactively present referees. The respect campaign by the FA is admirable, but there's an amazing vacuum in our game, and a vacuum in which there is no comment from referees or anybody speaking for referees. The number of frustrations I've had over the years trying to get a referee of any description to comment, they stay involved in it as assessors or whatever afterwards. Oh, I can't comment. And they're actively discouraged from doing so from the very top. And they fear commenting for the effect it's going to have on their career. And I think that in the 21st century, come on, these people, they're not young kids, they're not 18-year-old footballers. In most cases, they're 30, 40-year-olds, one case over 50. They're mature men who surely can be trusted to handle the media. And I think there should be a far more proactive approach. And I say that not only with a vested interest. And people who are allowed access, as I have on occasions in the past, have seen the agonising that goes on by top referees.
It's a great different perspective, and it's a book of a different perspective, I think. I think people are really going to enjoy it. Thank you so much for coming and doing this for us. We appreciate
Thank you, Nick. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, good. I'm really glad. Just one final reminder of the book. It's this one, Confessions of a Football Reporter by Alan Biggs. Takes you inside the game from the perspective of a football reporter. It's a fascinating and fun read. Do get yourself hold of a copy. My thanks once again to Alan Biggs. We'll see you for another book report very soon.